Hello, welcome back to the channel. I'm Zach Morkowski, and this is Sharper Pen Image Consulting. I'm continuing our reading of Friedrich Wilhelm Nietzsche's The Greek State, which is a short essay basically titled, or marked as Preface to an Unwritten Book in 1871. We started with the first two paragraphs, of which he's basically discussing the invention of the idea of the dignity of labor and the dignity of men, which Nietzsche is going to explain are modern contrivances when compared to what necessitated the terms in the first place. So, going on from the third paragraph here after saying, modern man is a unnatural amalgamation, therefore we believe in the dignity of man and the dignity of labor. He goes on, the Greeks did not require such conceptual hallucinations, for among them the idea that labor is a disgrace is expressed with startling frankness, and another piece of wisdom, more hidden and less articulate, but everywhere alive, added that the human thing also was an ignominious and piteous nothing, and the dream of a shadow. Labor is a disgrace because existence has no value in itself. But even though this very existence in the alluring embellishment of artistic illusions shines forth, and really seems to have a value in itself, yet that proposition is still valid, that labor is a disgrace indeed by the fact that it is impossible for man, fighting for the continuance of bare existence, to become an artist. In modern times, it is not the art-needing man, but the slave who determines the general conceptions. The slave who accordingly to his nature must give deceptive names to all conditions in order to be able to live. It's almost double-speak, or double-think even. Such phantoms as the dignity of man, the dignity of labor, are the needy products of slavedom hiding itself from itself. Woeful time in which the slave requires such conceptions in which he is incited to think about and beyond himself. Cursed seducers who have destroyed the slave state of innocence by the fruit of the tree of knowledge. Now the slave must vainly scrape through from one day another with transparent lies recognizable to everyone of deeper insight, such as the alleged equal rights of all, or the so-called fundamental rights of man as such, or the dignity of labor. Indeed, he is not to understand at what stage and at what height dignity can first be mentioned, namely, at that point where the individual goes wholly beyond himself and no longer has to work and to produce in order to preserve his individual existence. Right, and this was him saying before, the need to consume labor is this process, right? It is a process. And even on the height of labor, quote unquote, the Greeks at times is overcome by a feeling that looks like shame. In one place, Plutarch with earlier Greek instinct says that no nobly born youth on beholding the Zeus in Pisa would have the desire to become himself a Phidias, or on seeing the Hera in Argos to become himself a Polyclete. So he's saying like on seeing these statues, he doesn't want to become a sculptor. On seeing the Zeus in Pisa, he doesn't want to himself, imitate this man. And just as little would he wish to be Anacreon, Philetius, or Archilochus, however much he might revel in their poetry. So different Greek poets. To the Greek, the work of the artist falls just as much under the undignified conception of labor as any ignoble craft. So art is no better than manual labor. But if the compelling force of the artistic impulse operates in him, then he must produce and submit himself to that need of labor. And as a father admires the beauty and the gift of his child, but thinks of the act of procreation with shamefaced dislike, so it was with the Greek. The joyful astonishment at the beautiful has not blinded him as to its origin, which appeared to him like all becoming in nature to be a powerful necessity, a forcing of itself into existence. That feeling by which the process of procreation is considered as something shamefacedly to be hidden, although by it man serves a higher purpose than his individual preservation. The same feeling veiled also the origin of the great works of art, in spite of the fact through them a higher form of existence is inaugurated, just as though at the other act comes a new generation. The feeling of shame seems therefore to occur where man is merely a tool of manifestations of will infinitely greater than he is, infinitely greater than he is permitted to consider himself in the isolated shape of the individual. So the shame for the Greek aristocrat is basically to not belong to yourself, to not have a sort of sovereignty and a rank and distinction of difference and distance. So that's the fundamental premise here. And that distance has been covered up in time, not with progress, not with education, not with rationality, but with art and with Platonic ideals in the form of the creation and invention of a population like a general public once upon a time with the literate audience. It came to exist with the invention of the Gutenberg press, and now with mass man by way of invention of television, radio, television, now internet, mass communication, making mass people who all share the same bodies of knowledge or beliefs within our retribalized world culture here, if you will. Going back to the beginning, it begins with him saying, these are contrivances. The Greeks did not need these contrivances. They made their own. So the Greeks did not require such conceptual hallucinations like the dignity of man and the dignity of labor. That did not exist in their culture. For among them, the idea that labor is a disgrace is expressed with startling frankness. Right? I talked about Hephaestus, the god of technology, and that technology is invoking demons almost as if a compensation for the fact that you got thrown out from on high and you're a piteous, ignoble nothing, right? And another piece of wisdom, more hidden and any less articulate, but everywhere alive, added that the human thing was also an ignominious and piteous nothing, and the dream of a shadow. Labor is a disgrace because existence has no value in itself. But even though this very existence in the alluring embellishment of artistic illusions, right, religion, philosophy, belief, faith, the way a culture is conditioned by their language and their customs to be blind to what they're actually even a part of, but existing within inside of, right? So labor is a disgrace because existence has no value in itself, right? It's given value by culture, by art, by language, by the highest representations and representers of a culture. And in Greek terms, Nietzsche differentiates the Apollonian from the Dionysian, one being there eternally, as immutable as the sun rising, the other one being, the underworld swallowing you from below. So existence has no value in itself. But even though this very existence in the alluring embellishment of artistic illusions, right? Deleuze warned, if there's not people doing philosophy, it's going to be taken over and done by marketers and advertisers, and it has been all along, and it's only gone further in that direction, right? So similarly, but even though this very existence seems to have a meaning, it's the creations of the culture itself. It's the spoils, it's the gold, really. And really seems to have a value in itself, yet that proposition is still valid, that labor is a disgrace indeed by the fact that it is impossible for man, fighting for the continuance of bare existence, to become an artist, right? He can't do anything novel with his existence. He is subject to greater forces. In modern times, it is not the art-needing man, but the slave who determines the general conceptions, right? This is political correctness because the masses need an identity, but in reality, the nature of the state and warfare has been dislocation, disruption, dismemberment, destruction, right? A casting forth and a destruction of groups and then a regrouping over time. That formerly that was all of what animal existence was bare bones survival. The only thing that separated us from the animals was that we became creative. We learned to be creative, not just weapons and tools, but art itself. And that's where the family took off. That's where religion took off. That's where the state eventually, where binding these small tribes and families could finally take off as well. So, um, in modern times, right, it said it's not the art-needing man, but the slave who determines the general conceptions, right? Because we can't be honest. Giving an example, like in America, it's always been taught, like, don't talk about income, right? I mean, you see that the whole culture and its commercialism and advertising has flown in the face of this and pissed a lot of people off in the sense that people see the disparity. People see behind, behind the screen and behind the wizard, there's a third world lurking, basically, right? So, and then an extreme distance between those sophisticated to keep up with modern civilization and those who keep falling further and further behind because they still think we're going to go back to a 19th century model or a 20th century model at this point. Um, so, again, has no value except what's created and given to it, what can be appreciated. The slave has to give deceptive names in order to be able to live. Charles Bukowski famously said, slavery never went away, it just changed forms. Such phantoms as the dignity of man, the dignity of labor, are the needy products of slavedom hiding itself from itself. He's saying it's power. It's people being subject to power, and where this is all hidden by language. Woeful time in which the slave requires such conceptions, in which in language is perception, in which he is incited to think about and beyond himself. Cursed seducers who have destroyed the slave state of innocence by the fruit of the tree of knowledge. And this could be anyone. You could consider Deleuze and Foucault. You could consider Nietzsche himself. You could consider Socrates. Basically, anyone who comes along and says, I have a new idea, I have another idea, the notion of the Hegelian dialectic or the Whig history, the story of progress, right? All these other fictions, all these other stories when really time just stands still, all right? Now the slave must vainly scrape through one day from another with transparent lies recognizable to everyone of deeper insight, such as the alleged equal rights of all or the so-called fundamental rights of man as such, or the dignity of labor. Nietzsche makes it sound like we're assailed by these, like we're under assault by these ideas, right? That it's souring our conception towards the reality of our existence. Indeed, he is not to understand at what stage and at what height dignity can first be mentioned, namely at the point where the individual goes wholly beyond himself, right? And arguably an act so rare and so hard, it's why it's just recognized, right? And then beyond that, where people begin to differentiate themselves into individuals, whether that's as artists or, whether they work for the military or the state or anything else in the world, right? No longer has to work to produce in order to preserve his individual existence, right? They generated a surplus. So even on the height of labor, in labors in quotes, the Greek at times is overcome by a feeling that looks like shame. In one place, Plutarch, with either Greek instinct, says, no nobly born youth on beholding the Zeus in Pisa would have had. So basically saying that the Greeks, the greatest aspiration was to be happy with who and what you were, and then to obtain and maintain your own sovereignty and be as subject to as few forces outside yourself as possible, right? It makes sense that the Greeks exist, the Greek pantheon existing up on Mount Olympus, far removed from the concerns of mortals, right? They liked meddling, they liked using them, they liked toying with them, but they weren't exactly concerned with their well-being and their good. It's why even something like hope is considered evil, because it's hope to escape from that which is inexorable, as Nietzsche later describes it, right? It is wholly immutable, that power is indomitable in the world and always has been. But, he's saying those cursed seducers of the will, again, whether that's the Rousseaus of the world, even the Americans of the world, right, selling this fantasy that everyone can be a rebel, everyone can have a piece of the dream, and then in reality, you see, no one was planning on sharing, no one was ever planning on paying that much. People who have something usually work pretty damn hard to get it themselves, and I think something like the middle class, and especially in the larger scheme of history, is going to be as quaint and archaic one day as what we tend to think of in the West of, oh, the primitive hunter-gatherer society. Like that organization of a tribe of people will be just like the word family tree will somehow be extinct someday. You could say, like, this is what I'm meaning, is that we've gone away from this idea that, at least on the front of it, that names don't mean something, that bloodlines don't mean something, right? That it's about some nameless, strange mass. No, he's saying that's not. They exist to be used by this pyramid structure of power. So again, he's saying the Greeks were, their highest art was to be basically happy with what they made of themselves. To the Greek, the work of the artist falls just as much under the undignified conception of labor as any ignoble craft, right? Maybe the ideal is that you're born perfect, and this relates to Hephaestus, right? gentlemen, guys and gals, the moral of the story is don't be born ugly, basically, right? So, but if the compelling force of the artistic impulse operates in him, then he must produce and submit himself to that need of labor, right? That it's no less shameful to be under something else's indomitable will. When the artist is inspired, when the muse takes hold, when the demon possesses him, right? That life is then just as much outside of his will as it arguably ever was. And nobility was to comport yourself out of this madness, to become a somebody. What? We were animals, though, just the other day. Don't you remember? Does anyone remember? Um, and as a father admires the beauty and the gift of the child, but thinks of the act of procreation with shamefaced dislike, so it was with the Greek. The joyful astonishment at the beautiful has not blinded him to its origin, which appeared to him, like all becoming in nature, to be a powerful necessity, a forcing of itself into existence. And if you're familiar with childbirth, it's messy, it's wet, bloody, dangerous, yeah, costly. You're in a position of vulnerability while you're engaging in it, right? There's a lot of, right, for all of human existence, it was the most dangerous position for woman and child to ever be in. Generally, once you're born, your conditions improve, but only so much. So from there, that feeling by which process of procreation is considered as something shamefacedly to be hidden. Christianity ran with this notion, but I think modern times and reality shows us that men and women just love and are obsessed with sex. So from there, although by it man serves a higher purpose than his individual preservation, the same feeling veiled also the origin of the great works of art, in spite of the fact that through them a higher form of existence is inaugurated, right? A different vision is granted, a higher vision is granted and shown, a ideal vision is granted and shown, just as through that by the other act comes a new generation. So he's saying just as a higher form of existence is inaugurated through art, right? And this is where it gets interesting. So it is, a new generation inaugurates the next round of beings and their becoming. However, and with that, shame goes in both of those. But what I was thinking and what I mentioned on the screen in the last video is that out of all the work, it's interesting that intelligent work, creative work, scientific work, intellectual labor is the only labor that anyone and everyone, from the state and institutions to the average idiot and the masses themselves, feel that they have the right to expound on, to interrupt, to disrupt, to argue with, to fight, to prevent, right? Everyone thinks they should control knowledge and art. And then you begin to understand just how powerful they are, just how dangerous they are, why they exist, right? Um, Basically, Nietzsche's painting, he's getting to the he's starting from the heart of the noble lie and cutting it out of the being in this paper, right? Because if you recall, Socrates in Plato's Republic said, we can't teach him from poetry anymore. It's not going to do for the future. People aren't going to understand things like they need to. So we're going to teach them math. We're going to teach them rationality. We're going to give them a noble lie, tell them they were born from the earth or a sky god, right? Same difference. It doesn't matter. It could have been anything. And what Nietzsche's going to get into is that in any culture, we see the same patterns. We see the same values. We see the same master and slave dynamics and the same morality that hides these things, finds its enemies and, promotes what's good and throws what's ugly off Mount Olympus or whatever the God's home is, casting out the demons, the ugly, the lacking. So, accordingly, we must accept this cruel sounding truth that slavery is the essence of culture, right? That without slavery, the grand works of art, whether that's the Great Pyramids or Athens or America or the record industry or anything, the modern record industry, that this couldn't happen without exploiting the artists for all the middlemen to take their piece, right? So accordingly, we must accept this cruel sounding truth that slavery is the essence of culture. A truth, of course, which leaves no doubt is the absolute value of existence. That basically that all of existence as we know it, especially as moderns, is built on slavery, which is built on the complete devaluation and utter disregard for human life, for human suffering, the utter disregard for that human beings are conscious and suffer immensely, that they're bewildered animals and often go crazy as a result of the power struggle and power games. So this truth is the vulture that gnaws at the liver of the Promethean promoter of culture, right? This is why liberalism eats itself. It's the same reason the God of Christianity died. It died from its own pity. It died from its own sorrow, its own weakness at feeling sorry for itself. It could no longer bind a culture as any kind of cohesive unit of any caste or class, whether that was silver, bronze, or gold, whether that was craftsmen, military people, or aristocrats, ruling class, right, senators. So the misery of toiling men must still increase in order to make the production of the world of art possible to a small number of Olympian men. So those people engaged in novelty. And it's interesting that despite this, throughout all time, people are afraid of change, and culture is about stasis, honoring the past, keeping it alive in the present. Yet only the people who are into novelty are the ones who are okay with change. And the change has been inevitable, right? It's Heraclitean, right? That flux is the nature. So here is to be found the source of that secret wrath nourished by communists and socialists of all times, and also by their feebler descendants, the white race of the liberals, right? That reality doesn't match up with their desired fantasy and their ideals, that Krusty isn't coming, that the revolution never really happened, or in other maybe with what you can see in the media, that the revolution is stuck perpetually happening. There's no getting past it. There's no one coming. There's no one going to save anybody. There's no one who is actually in it to help or save the masses and the people. People are in it for themselves, right? So this is what, and anyone who wants to say, no, but culture and art, it's good, it's civilizing. Christianity civilized the world. You may think that, but I promise you, this world is nowhere near as civilized as what people imagine it to be. This was the cultural embellishment to say, look, we could fool ourselves into believing it's safe. We could fool ourselves into taking for granted people's sanity, right? And when that snaps, what does that look like? Everything from daily road rage incidents to just people losing their minds, not being able to keep up with the flux and the changing of times and the inevitable catastrophes that humanity has been building towards all along in this very power struggle. So he's saying that basically this is the internal contradiction, that bird does not fly. Um, and then he's saying, right, that communists, the socialists, the feebler white race of the liberals, not only it's against the arts, right, it's against creativity because you need slavery for the creativity, but also against classical antiquity because that was the model, right? And this is right, and I mentioned in the last video, Jesus hated the state, Jesus hated the church, he hated the Jewish religion, or at least the practiced and interpretation of it, because he was an idealist and he believed in a perfect world, and it just, again, was so far removed from reality, they killed him. But not for the same reason that is projected, is just power, right? Because he was competing with the state, you know. Um, and then something like render unto Caesar is saying, like, you can't fight City Hall. But at the same time, you could say it also sounds like something a state would say. The misery of toiling men must still increase in order to make the production of the world of art possible to a small number of Olympian men. And then again, in the capitalistic age and the age of the middleman, it's so a few people can have all the stuff. Nothing or little for everyone else. The billions get nothing, little to nothing, and a few people get everything, right? That's the name of the game. So here's to be found the source of that secret wrath nourished, right? This is why communists, socialists, liberals are against modern life and classical life and against life, period. They don't actually realize their stance winds up being nihilistic as Christianity itself. So not only against the arts, but also against classical antiquity. If culture really rested upon the will of a people, if here inexorable powers did not rule, powers which are law and barrier to the individual, then the contempt for culture, the glorification of a poorness in spirit, the iconoclastic annihilation of artistic claims would be more than an insurrection of the suppressed masses against drone-like individuals. It would be the cry of compassion tearing down the walls of culture itself. And then, when he mentions cursed seducers in the first place, you could say, why does the average person need to concern themselves with politics at all? It's so beyond them, in power and in say and otherwise. Um, and then from here, the idea of, okay, you can make people free, But the boundaries of the social world and the technological world and the sophistication of human communication all still exist as barriers to individuals, even if we could strip away the state apparatus, which is invisibly and thoroughly, enveloping the globe, right? There's no place free from it. And all of that exists as power and a binding agent. And he's saying that if you really tried to assert the glorification of poorness in spirit, the glorification of the masses, of the dignity of labor, if you actually tried to honor that contract, that very honoring becomes the destruction, because the culture and the state couldn't exist without the exploitation of the masses. So I'm going to go ahead and stop there. Gets to the point that, as I was saying, the point of culture is, unless it continues to operate as it does, then it just can't exist. To go out of stasis is the most risky thing any culture ever could do, which is to try something new. But novelty and change throughout history, have brought us to this point. We got out of the trees as primates, off the grasslands, into huts, into homes, eventually settled nations, mixed, interbred, swamped the planet, all mismatched, all sorts of people where they do and don't belong, right? Born all over the place. And the only reason we're here as modern people is because the whole thing has been out of control. But the real nature of this state, of these power, has not changed from the beginning. And that's that there is no dignity of man. There is no dignity of labor. The culture exists to create novelty for itself, to amuse itself, because life is otherwise bare bones animal existence. And we've been doing that so long, it no longer suits us. It's no longer suitable to an intelligent, sapient, self-conscious being who can become conscious of what others think and feel too, right? Because so many of these things go beyond the self, yet we see that so many people have been burdened with thinking beyond themselves in ways they're not supposed to, in ways they can't comprehend. People losing their minds, people not being able to handle the truth, or not even concerning themselves with truth, therefore never understanding the changes that are happening around them, being confused and mistaken about the nature of life, man, history, and the world, because everyone thinks they already know what's what. But again, back to the Greek state, it winds up being the nightmare in broad daylight. So I'm going to go ahead and stop there, and we'll resume reading next time. I'll start with the same paragraph here. Accordingly, we must accept the cruel sounding truth that slavery is the essence of culture, right? And in modern terms, like I said, capitalism is the essence of culture, because that's the altered form of slavery by which a few take everyone else's time, labor, ideas, art, money, right? It's a very powerful force. If you could think of like what kind of happened to human beings over time, is the tribe was assimilated by the state and then dispersed of as much as possible, and then every aspect of living is then uh, packaged, marketed, and resold to humanity through large-scale organizations, through marketers and advertisers and consultants who work with large state and other corporate entities to sell narratives, to sell products, to show things, to hide things, to do it all, right? So anyway, I'm Zach Markowski. This has been Nietzsche's The Greek State. Going to resume more next time. Thanks for checking out the channel. Like, share, subscribe. Share it with people you know. If you think they'd appreciate it, hit the notification button. Thanks. Bye.